Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on international climate finance, perspectives from Canada and the Caribbean. I chair the Group of 78, one of the three co-sponsors of this event. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm making these remarks from traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which has been home to Indigenous people for millennia. I further acknowledge that the work of Indigenous reconciliation is a responsibility of all Canadians, including those involved with the Group of 78, Climate Legacy, and the MacLeod Group, co-sponsors of this webinar in their work on international peace, economic and social justice, and planetary survival. This webinar is third in a series co-organized by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78, focused on financing the transition to a zero carbon economy. Last month, we hosted a webinar on the transition in the energy sector and one on greening the financial system. Today, our focus is shifting to financing the climate transition in the poorest countries, most of which have done little or nothing to cause the climate crisis, but are suffering its worst consequences through loss of lives, livelihoods, and property. We are delighted to have three distinguished panelists to help us understand the enormity of the challenges faced by these countries, in particular, the enormity of the challenge of adaptation and strengthening resilience to devastating climate change. Our two speakers, Dr. Spencer Thomas and Brian Tomlinson, will be introduced in a moment by our moderator, Jennifer Bansard. We're thrilled to welcome back Jennifer Bansard, who spoke in early January at our G78 webinar on what did and what did not emerge from COP27 and COP15 late last year. Jennifer is a political scientist with expertise in climate, biodiversity, and urban governance, as well as the role of science in environmental governance. She works at the German Advisory Council on Global Change, which provides science-based advice on sustainability issues. Jennifer is also a team leader, editor, and writer for the International Institute on Sustainable Development's Earth Negotiations Bulletin. She holds master's degrees from the Netherlands, France, and Germany, and she is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Potsdam in examining the emergence of the carbon sequestration potential of coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. Jennifer, thank you for moderating the session. Over to you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this very interesting, I'm already sure, discussion. We are going to structure this 1 hour that we have with first a round of moderated discussions with the two panelists for about 35 minutes, and then I'm going to open up for questions by everybody, all the participants. So please prepare your questions ahead of time. We are looking forward to where you're going to lead us with your interesting questions, I'm very sure. So on to our two very distinguished panelists. We are glad to have here two different perspectives. So we first have Dr. Spencer Thomas, who is a lead negotiator for climate change, but also for biodiversity. So having experience with different multilateral environmental agreements from the perspective of a small island state, namely Grenada in the Caribbean. He has lots of expertise on market cooperation, being currently the vice chair of the Clean Development Mechanism, which operates under the Kyoto Protocol in the context of international climate policy. He will provide us with a perspective on climate finance from the Caribbean. And our second distinguished panelist, Brian Tomlinson, having the perspective of Canada. He is Executive Director of AidWatch Canada, and has a long-standing experience analyzing Canadian Development Corporation, but also the role of civil society organizations in development cooperation more broadly. So we are going to benefit from their different viewpoints, and going to start by asking you some questions more general about the state of climate finance right now, before going into some more detailed questions on one of the big hot topics in the climate negotiations right now, namely loss and damage finance. So starting with you, Spencer Thomas, what is your perspective on the general state of where we're at in the provision of climate finance? Could you give us an overview in terms of maybe the adequacy? How have developed countries fulfilled their commitments so far in terms of providing climate finance? We'd very like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you. The classical unmuting, yes, great.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for your kind invitation to this webinar and for your kind introduction. And thank you for your invitation to bring some perspectives from the Caribbean region on this very important topic of climate finance. The first point I would like to make is that we see climate as a cross-cutting issue in the negotiations. We have climate finance is needed for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage, for technology transfer, for capacity building, throughout the entire negotiation process. So critical climate finance is important for building the trust in the negotiation. We think that it is critical for unlocking progress in the negotiation. So the point I'm making here is that climate finance is a most important aspect of the climate change negotiation. It is important for finance so that we can implement the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Convention as a whole. But with respect to small island developing states, Grenada being one of them, we believe that the central condition is the unique vulnerability and special circumstances of small island developing states like Grenada and the Caribbean. Of course, there is no dispute that those countries have high vulnerability. At the same time, they have limited capacity to respond to the disasters. They are all disaster-prone countries, and we know that. Every year, we have this issue. Of course, we are almost there already in the hurricane season. And again, we are expecting a very active season. We are also quite clear that these countries have low growth, and they are burdened by high debt, to the extent that some countries have debt to GDP ratios above 100%. On average, I think in the region might be about 80%. We are all aware of the impact on inflation. We are all aware of the fiscal imbalances in those countries and the whole question of energy security and food security. And of course, the limited capacity of those countries to respond to those economic issues. And of course, as a consequence, heavy reliance on international climate finance and international development finance. And at the same time, what we have noticed is that the flow of finance to those countries have been very, very small. Less than 3% of all international finance flows goes to all of these countries. So this is the context in which we are making our negotiation very clear and felt within the context of the UNFCCC negotiation. So with respect to finance, we ask for grant-based finance, public sources from the developed countries, because this is the key issue for us. And that there must be facilitated access to that finance. It must be adequate for the job at hand, for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, technology transfer, and capacity building. It must be new and predictable. And of course, there are some issues with transparency to ensure that there are transparency provisions so that the climate finance received would be well accounted for. At the same time, while we make this issue, we recognize there is a serious finance gap in the negotiations. Very serious. In fact, finance is a commodity in short supply in the region, in negotiation. It's way back in 2009, developed countries decided to have a target of 100 billion per year, and that has not been achieved up to this day, no matter what metric have been used to measure the climate finance received, of course. And we have to address those barriers, and of course, we have to address the issues relating to the metrics to determine the flows of climate finance. Of course, there is a very unhelpful debate in my view, which makes a clear distinction between climate finance and development finance. And this again is something that is very topical in the negotiation. Critical for us and has been mentioned already is the issue of adaptation and finance for adaptation. Again, there is a very significant gap in the finance for adaptation in particular. But I want to stop here in terms of bringing two major issues, which is slightly outside of the negotiation, but are very critical. The issue of eligibility to development finance and concessionary finance. And again, many of our countries in our region are classified as high and middle income countries. And at the same time, they are forbidden from getting concessional finance as a consequence. But at the same time, those countries have high debt, right? And again, they are susceptible to these natural disasters and are highly vulnerable. So that is an issue in the negotiations. Now, what we recognize with high debt, you have low credit rating, you have high interest rate, then you have more debt. You have high debt, you have a climate impact, you have more debt. And as a consequence, those countries are in that very vicious cycle. So we think that it is critical that we need some reform in the system. Now, there is a heavy debate going on in the UN now with respect to the multidimensional vulnerability index. And we believe, again, this is an opportunity to remake and to rechange the international landscape on climate finance. You will have heard about the Bridgetown initiative, piloted very strongly from our region, of course, which calls for the reform in the international financial institutions, the use of SDRs for climate action, and green investments focus and so on. All of these is trying to change the landscape of climate finance to make sure that it is fit for purpose and to be able to handle the issues at hand. So I want to stop here. I think we also have to bring in the whole question of private finance. I think we will come in that later in terms of the banks and then the fossil fuel industry and so on, and to ensure that we could crowd in and mobilize private finance as a complement to public finance, which is quite necessary to address the climate problem that is facing by those countries. So I will stop here.
Thanks a lot for this very extensive answer. There's so many things in what you said that I'm hoping we can pick up again in the discussions. You mentioned a lot of things about what is happening within the climate change negotiations, but also looking at the broader landscape and touching upon multilateral development banks. I'm sure that we can touch upon that more in a bit. But now I would like to have a bit contrasting perspective. Brian, you've had a keen and critical eye looking at what Canada does in the area of development cooperation. So from your perspective, what has Canada's reaction been? What is the position of Canada as a big donor and provider of climate finance? Last year, Canada has been one of with Germany, co-authors of a big report on how well developed countries are doing on the very famous 100 billion commitment. So yeah, it would be great for us to hear some of your views of what worked, what hasn't worked, where do you see areas for improvement?
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, and thanks to all for inviting us to be a part of this panel. As you said, I've done a fair bit of research and work on Canada's climate finance. So I'll just highlight a few points here, and then, as Dr. Thomas did, lead into a more thorough discussion of some of these issues. So I think, from my perspective, Canada's climate finance has a mixed record. And I'll elaborate that in a minute, but it's also on a trajectory of some improvements in some areas. So One of the biggest one is the fact that Canada doubled its climate finance in 2020 from 2.65 billion for the previous 5 years to 5.3 billion for the period up to 2025. So that's a notable achievement, and I think civil society here were quite encouraged by that. Also, the government put forward a plan for this climate finance. Some of it is somewhat vague and lacking in targets, but this did not they didn't have a plan for the 2.65 billion. So I think this is also progress. Part of that plan is to allocate 20% of kind of this 5.3 billion to nature-based solutions. So bringing together the biodiversity aspects of climate change into Canada's reaction. It also, and Canada has had a feminist international assistance policy for many years, and so there's a strong focus on transformative gender equality in the work that Canada is doing, and that carries forward into this new commitment of 5.3 billion. And lastly, in the positive side, I think there's been an increased access for civil society as partners in Canada's climate, implementing Canada's climate finance, particularly in the adaptation area, and a program of 300 million for partnering for climate, and 15 million, importantly, for Indigenous peoples organizations for their partnerships. So those are, I think, some of the positive trajectories. On the less than positive side, I think, certainly in the first 5-year tranche, the 2.65 billion up to 2020, there was a very, very heavy reliance on blended finance through the multilateral development banks for Canada's implementing Canada's climate finance. And it's not to say that, and we're going to talk about this, I'm sure, that the private sector doesn't have a role in climate finance, but more than half of Canada's climate finance in that first period went to 6 Canadian funds at the various multilateral development banks. And were said to be spent from Canada. But if you look at the details of those funds, they stretch over 40 years. And by my calculations, about 35% have actually been allocated to projects and programs. So, there's that optic of what are we spending in the earlier tranche. And that continues to a degree in the present tranche of 5.3 billion. But I think there is more transparency and less reliance on multilateral development banks to deliver Canada's climate finance. The adaptation question, Canada, and partly because of that bias towards the multilateral development banks, who in turn have a similar bias towards mitigation, Canada's climate finance is equally biased heavily towards mitigation. About 68 or so percent of that 2.65 billion went to mitigation. So about 36% maybe went to adaptation. Canada has a goal now for the new tranche of 40% adaptation. I think most would argue that both are important, and maybe we'll talk about this. There isn't a trade-off between one or the other, but without a lot of progress around mitigating the consequences of mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to have a need for much, much more adaptation. And so that is a deep weakness we feel in Canada's climate finance. Accompanying that is a focus on loans. Dr. Thomas mentioned this, and about 60% of Canada's climate finance has been loan finance. Now, that again is because of our reliance on the multilateral development banks in part, but not only. We are one of 2 donors that provide loans to the Green Climate Fund, along with France. We provide loans to IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So this as a modality for Canada's climate finance is highly problematic. There's been some improvement in transparency for sure. You can go on a website and find little paragraphs about each one of what Canada is supporting in climate finance. But, there has been one evaluation that I know of, which was on the implementation of gender equality in the multilateral development bank funds, but little reflection on what we've achieved or not achieved in the orientations that we've been given. So there's room for improvement there as well. Finally, I just want to say some broader points. Why would I say these are marginal improvements when we've been doubling climate finance? I think because climate finance, as I think Dr. Thomas intimated, is different than ODA. ODA at best is based on solidarity. It's often based more often on charity. Climate finance is actually driven by the imperative of physics, the physics of climate. And this, as we all know, is getting worse and worse. And so, and it's also therefore driven by who has been responsible for greenhouse gases historically. And therefore, the climate negotiations and the Paris Agreement itself is built on this notion of a common but differentiated responsibilities. And clearly the developed countries have this responsibility. Dr. Thomas talked about trust. You mentioned the review that Canada and Germany have done of the 100 billion. We're not there yet. Maybe we're there this year. Who knows? It all depends on how you count things too. So there's a lot of controversy around achieving that goal. But in terms of Canada, we're not even there at our fair share of that 100 billion. So our calculations is that about $9 billion over 5 years would be our share, that's in Canadian dollars, of our share of the 100 billion. We are at 5.3 billion, better than 2.65, but a long way from this fair share. We achieve our fair shares in other commitments. It is very striking that we don't do so here. We've yet to hear about what Canada's position is on going forward. We're in global negotiations on a new target post-2025. We're not even achieving the 100 billion. What does that say about trust in moving forward? We're at a point of replenishing the Green Climate Fund. Canada's commitment to the Green Climate Fund, as I said, has been loans, but it's also not changed. It's been $300 million in 2 tranches. So Canada is not putting, I think, its efforts into facilities that are under the UNFCCC, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. We do put money in those, but our emphasis is more in our own initiatives in the multilateral system, and as I mentioned, around the development banks. So I'll leave it there, and I think, hopefully we'll explore some of these questions, particularly around loss and damage, which is the agenda, I'm sure, for the next few months and leading up to the next COP. So I look forward to further discussion.
Thanks a lot for that great answer. Both of you provided a lot of information that paints this picture that we have a problem not just with the quantity, so the amount of climate finance that is provided, but also the quality of it, how easily it is accessed, but also what vehicles, what instruments are used to provide climate finance, especially with regards to adaptation. We have a similar discussion right now when we talk about how to address loss and damage, right? So a big breakthrough in Sharm el-Sheikh on countries agreeing that there would be funding arrangements for loss and damage. But now the big question is exactly how does that take shape from an institutional perspective? How would money be allocated? And a lot of the discussions now are moving forward to between assessing what we already have right now in the area of loss and damage, and a prominent candidate here is always the concept of insurance-based tools. Here, I would like to ask Dr. Thomas to provide us a perspective from the Caribbean, which is one of the sort of breeding grounds or pilot grounds for insurance-based mechanisms to address that. Could you give us a bit of details on the experience of this in the regions, some of the advantages and drawbacks? So what can actually be covered by insurance mechanisms in terms of disasters, and where do you see weaknesses in that regard? Sorry, you've got to unmute yourself again.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. Of course, COP27, the outcome on loss and damage was quite significant. You said, and I agree with you on this. But we have to recognize that loss and damage is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. Of course, it is the single most important outcome from the last COP. And of course, I believe as a consequence, the limits to adaptation have been recognized, and the whole question about loss and damage has already been felt in countries is also been recognized. Well, I have to indicate also that it took 30 years in the making. 30 years when it was first introduced, of course, by small island developing states way back in the early days of the convention. And it took that period to come to the point where we could be able to establish a loss and damage funding arrangement and a loss and damage facility. And at the same time, during the COP, we made some significant advances in respect to the Santiago network, the WIM and so on, and other aspects of loss and damage. But I believe one of the things which shadowed the loss and damage debate over the 30 years was the issue, which we can't get away from, the issue of liability and compensation. That has always been in the shadow of the negotiation and would have affected the negotiation to a large extent. From the small island developing states point of view, we believe that we need to address all of the aspects of loss and damage. Avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And we believe that each of these three is quite important. We need to avert, we need to minimize, and we need to address loss and damage. And we believe that the establishment of the fund and the funding arrangement will do a lot with respect to addressing the loss and damage issue. We believe that we also need to focus on economic losses, of course, and non-economic losses. And I think that is, again, something when you mention about the insurance mechanism, we might see the limitations of some of those mechanisms, being unable to handle some of the non-economic losses. But we have to do with both economic and non-economic losses. We also have to address the issue of slow onset events. Slow onset events, very important. Salination, reduction in soil productivity, agricultural productivity, migration, issues of loss of coastal ecosystem, beaches, and so on and so forth. Of course, slow onset event will also be in the equation, as well as, of course, the extreme weather events and extreme events which occur and which will take place in all the time with respect to the hurricanes and so on. We believe also that it is important that the transition committee, which is set up, must do its work, and do its work quickly and deliberately and comprehensively in terms of the scope, modalities, and the operationalization of the mechanism. Taking into consideration linkages with all the processes within the UNFCCC and beyond. The GST, for instance, will be a critical link between what we're doing in the loss and damage and also what we are doing on terms of the adaptation and mitigation and moving forward. We also clearly believe that loss and damage is tied to the issue of climate justice and equity. And I think Brian has already alluded to that. And what we recognize too, we have to recognize also that loss and damage is not, you cannot equate loss and damage financing with humanitarian assistance and disaster response funds. It's a completely different. The insurance mechanisms, it will be part of the toolbox, but it cannot address the whole multidimensional nature of loss and damage. We have an excellent example in the region, which is CRIF. The excellent model is necessary. It's a necessary model, we believe. Insurance is a necessary part of the toolbox, but certainly not sufficient. So we basically will say to you that loss and damage is a very important aspect. And hence the reason why several countries in our region has asked for a legal opinion with respect to what is the responsibility for the loss and damage issues going forward. So I think we are in a very unprecedented area in the negotiation on loss and damage. Time is of the essence, and I believe it is important that we work through the transition committee and ensure that we make a significant dent in the movement towards creating a different environment for loss and damage. As already indicated, if you don't mitigate adequately, if you don't adapt adequately, you will have to have loss and damage. And it's already been felt in countries like ours. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that answer. Brian, could I ask you to continue and share your views on the whole issue of loss and damage? You mentioned earlier questions of fair share. Spencer just mentioned questions of liability, who is responsible for the damages. Definitely those are big questions that influence how Canada is positioning itself on the global scene when it comes to the issue of loss and damage, right? Could you expand on that maybe?
Sure, I'll build on Dr. Thomas, which I fully agree and subscribe to as well. We don't know what Canada's position on loss and damage is. As Dr. Thomas mentioned, it took 30 years of evolution, and Canada only entered the game in the last hours in a positive way. Our environment minister did play a constructive role at that COP to bring about the result. But up to that point, we saw loss and damage as part of our funding for adaptation. And there are a few instances of that. So we need a long discussion here in Canada about how we're going to respond to not only the challenges, but the opportunities that the progress that we made in Egypt will be carried forward. I think we're looking towards a fund that is not the only mechanism, but a fund that is within the UNFCCC that provides new, additional to the 100 billion, additional to whatever targets are being discussed for post-2025. That's predictable and that's adequate. I mean, the estimates of loss and damage are in the 400 billion by 2030. So we're a long way from providing adequacy. I just, and maybe Dr. Thomas will correct me, but I ran across a statistic on the use of the Caribbean insurance mechanism in the Dominica hurricanes a couple of years ago. And they got about 1.5% of the costs of the damage from that insurance mechanism, according to what I had read. So, the insurance could be an important ingredient. We are talking about new financing tools, be they levies on marine transportation, which is currently being discussed quite actively now, on aviation transportation. We're coming back to discussions on the so-called Tobin tax, or the tax on financial transactions. So we do need different sources of funding to really respond to the challenges that the loss and damage issue really puts forward. And finally, while I certainly agree that responding to loss and damage is different than humanitarian assistance, but I think we also need to learn from the experience of 50 years of humanitarian assistance. And in that regard, humanitarian assistance is voluntary. So the UN is constantly putting out appeals, which more or less get filled in some cases, not in others. We need a mechanism here that is much more automatic, that does not respond to the interests of the donor per se, but responds to the needs on the ground in an automatic way. We need it to be locally driven in that regard, because local people, I saw this, I went to Dominica after the hurricane, and most of the reconstruction was done by local people responding to the destructions of their community. So they know best how to respond. So global mechanisms need to be structured in such a way that they support local initiative. And finally, they need to be, there needs to be a governance structure. And I think, we can build on the experience of the Green Climate Fund, which does have a more equitable governance structure. It's not without its issues and problems, but it's one that has been negotiated in the past and has a more inclusivity of southern countries, but also of other stakeholders such as civil society. So there's a lot ahead of us. It's probably not going to be all solved within the next 5 or 6 months, but hopefully we can make progress. And I think here in Canada, we need to concentrate our efforts in ensuring that our government continues to play a constructive role in this area and putting forward positive suggestions for along these lines.
Thanks a lot for that. So before we open up for the questions by the participants, and I'm happy to already see that there are some in the chat, inviting everybody to continue posting questions. I'll pick them up in just a few minutes. Just to give you 1 minute each, maybe, to highlight from your perspective, what are the next steps that we are to look at maybe this year in terms of climate finance. We've mentioned earlier the World Bank special drawing rights. Where do you see will be the big focus of climate finance discussions? Will it be in the UNFCCC, or will it be outside and looking at other types of actors in the field of climate finance? And I'd ask each of you to briefly share your views on that.
So I'll let Brian. Brian, you could go.
Oh, okay. I'll go first. Well, unfortunately, I think most of this discussion is going to happen outside of the UNFCCC. We have the French summit coming up at the end of June, and while that might be a constructive initiative, I mean, from my civil society colleagues, including those in France, I mean, who gave France the mandate to try to resolve broad financial issues? So there are discussions underway. There's also, of course, the Bridgetown initiative that was mentioned at the front end by Dr. Thomas, important initiative. But my fear in that is that the transformative elements of the Bridgetown initiative are slowly being seeped out in terms of the discussion. So in the original initiative, there was a proposal for 500 billion of SDRs to be a special fund for resilience. Now you don't see that much anymore. There's still, the focus in the initiative around reform of the multilateral bank system. But we know where that's been going. We just had the last meetings of the World Bank, and there isn't an awful lot of progress or even appetite there for reform. So I hope that we can bring some of these discussions of finance, the important ones, back into the UNFCCC with all its problems and issues. It is the legitimate forum for these discussions, and we need to have countries like Canada and others making positive suggestions to bring that forward. They're going to be, in my view, should be around loss and damage. But also we need to find constructive ways to draw on other pools of funding to ensure that these are being taken care of. But the last point to make is my gut feeling is that often donors put forward these proposals of alternative sources of funding to avoid the hard question of how they are going to come up with their commitments, their fair share of these funds. And so we need both. We don't just need Tobin taxes and aviation fees.
Well, I'm happy that you go first, because I think I agree with everything that you have just indicated. Clearly, I think the Bridgetown initiative is very significant. Work along the lines of the macro summit will be also important. The initiatives by the Secretary General, of course, on climate finance will be quite important. And I think I agree with you. I think there is some measure of reduction on the Bridgetown initiative as we go forward in the negotiation, and we need to be mindful of it. I think we got to be more ambitious and more aggressive in terms of changing that landscape, that climate finance landscape that we're talking about here. One of the things I want to add is there might be a scope for the private sector involvement in this. It has to be well orchestrated and well done properly. We look at what is happening with the big oil, for instance, and the profits that were made over the last 12 months. And we see while these companies are making those huge profits, countries are suffering from damage from climate events and can't even repair from those damage. I mean, at the same time. So there is this issue of justice. There is this of fairness, and that's the reason why in the negotiation there is this just transition issue, and climate justice will be a very topical issue as we go forward. So I will believe that the debate will be both within and without of the UNFCCC. it will have to be a comprehensive debate. It has to involve all players and all areas, all sources, in my view, and it has to require a significant change in the current landscape.
Thanks a lot for these comments. Now I'm going to open up for participants' questions. We have about 15 minutes for that. There are many questions already. I'm going to try summarize some to then give you more time to answer them. One thing you've mentioned, Brian, already is the idea of taxes or levies on specific types of activities like aviation. Here in the chat, we've got one question about having the Canadian mining sector be charged an environmental tax to fund, for example, climate action in the Caribbean. I'm going to use that as an opportunity to ask you about your perspectives on this, about the mining sector, but more in general, this idea of putting a tax on environmentally harmful activities to fund climate action.
That's to me, I guess. Well, I'm not an expert in these areas of alternative financing mechanisms for sure, but we've been talking about some of them for a long time. But I think what the climate issue brings to the table here that's maybe different is this notion of polluter pay. And Dr. Thomas mentioned the tremendous profits of the fossil fuel industry. I read a statistic today that the fossil fuel industry has been earning $2.3 billion a day for the last 30 years as profits. So, I mean, there is no lack of finance out there, be it the fossil fuel industry or the mining sector. And certainly, I think it's been a long-standing premise of environmentalism that the polluter pays, and so in Canada we've had a lot of experience of mining extraction in our own country, let alone in other citizens' countries, and we failed here for over many years to really implement that principle, and I would fully support. Looking at all options in terms of financial ways of recovering some of that money to put to not only the climate issue, but also biodiversity, which has its own stream of funding requirements. So, I think, this is a time to really open up all of these discussions that have, as I mentioned, have been going on for a while. And really being serious about them. And we need government sponsors to bring them forward. In that regard, France has been somewhat of a leader. They have had, I think, a form of aviation tax, if I'm not mistaken, for some time now. So we need to draw on that experience.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, as a segue in this, while we have all the profits made from the fossil fuel industry, at the same time, the subsidies to fossil fuel industry is also very, very high. So you have it on both sides, tremendous profits on one side and tremendous subsidies for fossil fuel production. And I believe this is goes back to the point of justice, climate justice.
Yeah.
Perfect. That was exactly another question in the chat, wondering about fossil fuel subsidies. It's a common thing that we hear in discussions on the volume of climate finance, right? So putting on the one side how much climate finance is actually provided and how much governments of developed countries are still subsidizing fossil fuel development, both at home, but also internationally, which poses another whole set of questions. Maybe they're bringing in the whole idea of fossil fuel non-proliferation. We are seeing some Pacific Island states that are opening up to this idea of very head-on addressing the idea of fossil fuels. We know that in the climate negotiations, there's a lot of discussions right now around phasing out coal and or all fossil fuels. Maybe Dr. Thomas, could you expand on your ideas in that regard? Do you see that going anywhere anytime soon, or are you pessimistic on that?
Well, I think the science is quite clear, and the science have determined a pathway. IPCC AR6 have provided a pathway to a different future, and one of the elements of the pathway is the issue of phasing out of coal and phasing out, and I would say out and not down, of fossil fuel, and that we were quite clear on that coming out of Glasgow. But what we see since then, as a consequence of maybe geopolitical tensions, is a kind of clawing back on that issue to some extent. We have seen it that the language is changing slightly now to phasing out of fossil fuel emissions and not phasing out of fossil fuel, which is significantly different. We have seen many countries that are getting more aggressive now in terms of exploitation of fossil fuel reserves. And we see that the developed countries themselves are encouraging developing countries in Africa and otherwise to start exploiting. And under the guise that, well, the geopolitical situation forces us into that direction, which I think was a significant reversal. So these are quite important issues for us. We also see coming out of several of the meetings that the emphasis now is also on carbon capture and storage rather than taking the real reductions out of the air. And what we recognize is that while we focus on carbon reduction methodologies, we are pumping more carbon in the atmosphere. So we are going in the wrong direction, in my view, and it requires something else to turn us to a course correction. That's why we have the GST, the Global Stock Take, and this will be a significant aspect of the negotiations this year to see whether or not we are able to correct or course correct as a consequence of not being on the correct direction and backsliding on in my view on agreed agreements. Yeah.
Maybe I could just add a bit, because I think there is a Canadian angle very sharply to this now. $1 billion of our $5.3 billion has been put into a new climate investment fund at the World Bank, accelerating past coal, with a focus on plans in South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam to this point. And I've been following that to some degree, particularly in the South African context. And one of the important points of this 1 billion is that 20% of it is to be dedicated to community and other processes to ensure a just transition. So, I mean, I think these are, as we know in our own country, very, very difficult discussions at the community level, at the country level, in order to ensure that justice is done in this transition. And there is obviously a lot of domestic politics that enters into it. So in the case of South Africa, it is very unclear what the transition out of coal is, where it's going to go. I mean, there is as Dr. Thomas indicated, there's talk now of transforming the coal facilities into those using natural gas. So maybe that's somewhat better than coal, but natural gas produces methane, and methane is a far more destructive greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, although less in terms of its longevity. So there are a lot of issues in this transition that are tough, and I think perhaps in Canada we have the advantage of this fund, and perhaps we can use that as an entry point for us here to explore how a just transition can be rolled out, particularly working with colleagues, civil society colleagues in the countries concerned.
Thank you both for these answers. So now many of these questions touched upon sort of the mitigation side of things. We've also got a question in the chat on adaptation, raising the question earlier, Brian, you mentioned that the Canadian government has its target of 40% of its climate finance spent on adaptation. We have the big question, why not more? if developing countries, many of the developing countries, at least the most vulnerable, have specific needs on the adaptation side rather than local mitigation, since their emissions are relatively small on a global comparison. Why not focus more on adaptation? I'm going to provocatively leave that, but maybe giving the cue of, or the very hyped concept of, what is a bankable project? And that ties into why are many of these energy projects rather easily financed also with private funding, and why is that not the case for adaptation? Where is the challenge in financing adaptation projects? And what does it mean for the question of should it be public or private finance that is devoted to adaptation? Maybe starting with Spencer Thomas on that.
Well, there's a lot of issues here, but of course, from our perspective, we need more finance for adaptation as well as more finance for mitigation. If you have insufficient resources, no matter how you allocate them between adaptation and mitigation, they're not enough, and that is the bottom line. So we need to have resources to handle the issues and the problems that we face in both adaptation and mitigation. Of course, the small countries of the region have not and will not be like will not be putting carbon in the atmosphere to the extent that will damage anybody. Of course, we know that, but at the same time, we are going to be suffering from the impact of the carbon in the atmosphere. So the question here is, we are already feeling the issues. We are really experiencing the need for adaptation finance. And as a result, finance for adaptation is quite important for the countries of our region. We need to build that resilience, as we're talking about, to climate change, so that we can at least take care of the issues on the national and community levels. So while we agree that the monies to adaptation is low, we believe that we need more funds for both adaptation and mitigation. We see that as this one coin with a head and a tail. We don't see it as fighting between adaptation and mitigation for the resources that are available. What we see is more resources being available for both adaptation and mitigation, and for loss and damage, and for technology transfer, and for capacity building. We see that what is required, that resources need to be grant-based as a consequence of the socioeconomic context, which I've already indicated, and the need to look at the issue as climate justice going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, I certainly share that. I mean, in arguing for more money for adaptation, it's not arguing for less money for mitigation. There is no trade-off here. Yeah, without mitigation, we are in a much, much worse mess than we already are. And that has to be clear, and that's going to take tremendous investment. But it has to start here in Canada and in other developed countries. What are we doing here to mitigate, the huge amount of greenhouse gases that we are responsible for? So, we're not in kind of a zero-sum game here, and we need to recognize that. Why isn't there more for adaptation? I mean, I think there's some particular aspects in the Canadian reality from my point of view. Certainly, we have a government that doesn't put much stress on ODA, or official development assistance, per se. And so, we had a last budget where, there's been a 15% effective cut in Canadian ODA. We see loans often in Canadian ODA. They're called refundable grants in some cases, kind of a contradiction in terms there. But anyway, much of that part of that is because the government can count those as credits. They're not expenditures on the public accounts. And so the government would argue, well, they can put a little bit more into climate change issues. Governments and certainly Canada are risk averse. And so many of the countries that we're talking about here are fragile and highly vulnerable countries who are situations that are difficult to work within. So in other statistics, it's very telling that, so far in adaptation, $2.10 per person has been put to fragile and conflict-affected states versus, $61.70 for other developing countries. So, there's something there that we need to grapple with, and in a broader sense, for all of our development cooperation to work more effectively in difficult and fragile situations. Adaptation, as both of us have been mentioning, is a local, has a very strong local dimension to be effective. So we need to change the architecture of development cooperation itself. We need to get away from the colonial structures that we've created here, where the donors call all the shots and setting up all the structures and institutions to say how the money is going to be managed and transferred. We need to move to, I feel, a much more decentralized process where power is shared at the country level, and where decisions are made in a co-financing way around addressing complex issues on the ground. So there's many issues here, and so it's not just a matter of 40% to adaptation or 50%. It's how you actually are working with that money to make it effective in really meeting the challenges.
Well said.
Many thanks. Yeah, I think it is very clear that you've been bouncing your answers off each other, agreeing on many, if not all points, and I certainly subscribe to all of them as well. So seeing that we have only 4 minutes left in this discussion, I would first of all like to thank you both for having provided this very deep perspective on the current status of climate finance discussions from the Canadian perspective, from the perspective of Grenada and Caribbean states more broadly, and for this very deep insight into both discussions within the UNFCCC, but also looking at broader issues in terms of not only the finance architecture specific to climate change, but really tying these discussions to issues of sustainable development, cooperation, finance, more generally. A lot of the questions in the chat, and we couldn't address all of them, went into a lot of these ties, also basically looking at what is the situation of individual countries in terms of stability. You mentioned that, Brian, just now, looking at issues of peace and conflict, and what does that do to the capacity of individual countries to invest locally. And we've had discussions and comments by Dr. Thomas about debt restructuration, which follows the same line, right? So having developing countries free up fiscal space by addressing these questions on a global scale so that they can have room to breathe and invest in the mitigation and adaptation actions that they need. And with that, I want to thank you again. Thanks to the participants for the questions and them joining here. And I would like maybe to pass over to Roy for some final words and maybe an outlook on the next subject of the very interesting webinars that you have going on. Roy, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for a fantastic job mediating an incredibly informative and rich discussion that we've had over the past hour. I won't add any closing comments, but I will add a final question, which I hope we have a minute or two to address. Brian mentioned the possibility earlier of $500 million billion SDR transfer for climate financing purposes. And I was just wondering if you had any further thoughts on this. There's been a lot of discussion about the IMF setting up a resilience and sustainability trust in order to finance climate action. Did you have any thoughts on this? Why has this very interesting proposal stalled? Why has it seeped away, to use Brian's term? Dr. Spencer?
Oh, okay. I thought it was Brian. I was waiting on Brian to respond. I think your point is quite clear. I mean, and has already been said, I think they are negotiating away some of these very important issues. And I think we need to just stick to our guns. Because where we're talking here, we're not only talking climate change, we're talking holistic sustainable development. So these SDGs must be in the mix for for finance and climate finance. We understand that the pathway for climate finance is very clear. It is technically feasible, it's financially feasible, and all of these resources are available. I think what we need is a redesign of that global system that to address the climate issue and the sustainable development issue. We need a new and emerging international financial landscape. We need to change it. And I believe we need to do so in an aggressive manner. We cannot do it in an incremental manner. It has to be done a transformation of the system to make that point. So the SDRs issue is quite significant, and I think we have to go at a higher level than at the lower level, and it is feasible, and it is practical, and it is part of the climate justice debate that we are putting forward.
And just to add a cautionary note, the experience so far of the IMF Resilience Fund, where this has been created, I mean, SDRs in principle are an ideal resource because they come with no cost, and therefore they should be allocated with no cost. But in fact, in the Resilience Fund, it has become a loan fund, and it is conditionalities are now being attached to it. And so, you know, Dr. Thomas' point is correct. I mean, we need to have some fundamental reforms of the very structures of finance here if we are actually going to be effective in using these innovative sources of finance. And donors haven't even been putting up SDRs to the resilience funds at this point. Some have, but some have been reluctant for reasons that I'm not aware of. But you know, it's been a long, hard sell to actually move donors to transfer SDRs to that resilience fund.
Okay, thank you both. That's an excellent point on which to end. We need transformation, we need climate justice, and we need a lot of work in the months and years ahead to make these things happen, because they're not going to happen overnight. But we've got no time to waste. And thank you again so much for your insights and your thoughts. And thank you, Jennifer, for moderating. And thanks to all our participants. Our next webinar in the series will be on agriculture, financing the transfer in the transition in agriculture sometime over the next month. So thanks again. Take care, and let's work for these common goals.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks.